Victorian England, 1847. In the small village of Mornhall, lost among endless forests and shrouded in fog, stood the old Red Hollow mansion. Its dilapidated walls, like old bones, concealed darkness that had accumulated for decades. The mansion belonged to the Laycroft family, aristocrats whose names had long disappeared from city chronicles. The last heir of the family, Lady Elizabeth Laycroft, returned to the house after a long absence to claim her inheritance. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, something strange began to happen. On the first night, Elizabeth woke to the creaking of floorboards. Through the canopy of her bed, she saw a shadow gliding across the wall. Her breath caught in her chest when she glimpsed a distorted face in the mirror opposite her bed. The face of a child with empty eye sockets. She convinced herself it was just exhaustion, but every night the visions grew more vivid. The remaining servants whispered that orphans had once been kept in the mansion's basement, and that the locked room on the third floor was haunted by a ghostly girl who called for her mother at night. The longer Elizabeth stayed in the house, the more the walls seemed to close in on her. The portraits of her ancestors appeared to watch her, their painted eyes moving, their lips twisting into cruel smiles. She began finding strange objects, an old doll with gouged out eyes, symbols burned into the wooden floor, and her grandfather's journals mentioning a black room in the basement that no one dared enter. The journals described rituals conducted to commune with the spirits of dead children. Elizabeth felt a cold hand of fear tightening around her heart, yet she couldn't leave. It was as if the house itself held her captive. Elizabeth resolved to explore the basement. Descending with a lantern, she discovered rusty chains embedded in the walls and small handprints on the stone. In a distant corner stood a chest. She opened it, releasing an icy chill, along with the whisper of countless voices. The basement door slammed shut on its own, trapping Lady Laycroft in complete darkness. The whispers grew louder, swelling into a heartbreaking chorus of children's cries. She saw shadows of children leaning toward her, their faces contorted with suffering. She spent hours in the basement until the door finally swung open by itself. Weakened and shaken, Elizabeth climbed back upstairs. But from that night on, she was no longer the same. Her face became pale, her eyes hollow. The servants fled the house, leaving her alone with the shadows. The next day, the servants abandoned the mansion, and villagers claimed that at night, silhouettes of children could be seen in the windows of Red Hollow. The mansion fell silent, but its legend endured. It's said that sometimes in the stillness, you can hear someone whisper Elizabeth's name. The story became a scary tale for children, but those brave enough to approach the ruins swore they saw a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing on the doorstep, holding the hand of a little girl with empty eyes. Sometimes on moonless nights, laughter echoes from the mansion, only to dissolve into drawn-out sobbing. The legend says Elizabeth's spirit became part of Red Hollow's curse. She remained forever the mother of the ghostly children whose souls never found peace. Victorian England, 1862. On the outskirts of Blackthorn, a village veiled in perpetual mist, stood Ashwood Orphanage, an enormous, crumbling structure whose shadow stretched long over the surrounding fields. The orphanage had once been a grand estate, but its stone facade was now cracked and ivy-choked, the windows like vacant eyes staring into the soul of the forest beyond. The orphanage's matron, Miss Clara Winfield, was a severe woman with hollow cheeks and fingers as thin as twigs. The children whispered that she never slept, that she drifted through the hallways at night like a specter, her footsteps barely brushing the floor. They said she spoke to someone who wasn't there, someone who spoke back. The building itself seemed to breathe with an unnatural life. The floorboards groaned even when no one stepped on them, and the walls exhaled a faint chill, as if the orphanage resented the presence of the living. The children avoided the east wing, where the doors never stayed closed and a constant, rhythmic tapping echoed from the attic above. One cold autumn evening, a new child arrived at Ashwood, a pale girl named Marianne. She rarely spoke, clutching an old porcelain doll with a cracked face and a missing eye. The other children avoided her, not because she was strange, but because the doll would sometimes turn its head when no one was looking. Marianne would sit in the corner of the playroom, whispering to the doll, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing its jagged cracks. Shortly after Marianne's arrival, things began to change. The children woke to scratches on their doors. A faint lullaby echoed through the corridors, though no one could tell where it was coming from. At night, they saw figures standing at the edge of their beds, silhouettes of children, their faces shadowed and indistinct. The air grew heavy, the darkness deeper. One of the older boys, Samuel, tried to speak to Marianne. He asked her where she had come from, why her eyes always seemed glazed with sadness. She only looked at him and whispered, "She doesn't like it when you ask questions." That night, Samuel vanished. His bed was found neatly made, with his favorite toy placed carefully on the pillow. The older children tried to tell Miss Winfield, but she dismissed their fears with cold indifference. She locked the nursery at night, ignoring the muffled cries that sometimes seeped through the wood like smoke. But the voices grew louder, and the shadows multiplied. One by one, the children began disappearing. Their names were scratched onto the walls of the East Wing in jagged, uneven letters. Miss Winfield herself changed. She grew thinner, her skin sagging as if something inside her was draining away. Her eyes sunk deep into her skull, and the children swore her shadow stretched and writhed on its own, even when she stood perfectly still. One stormy night, the remaining children decided to escape. They crept through the halls, avoiding the rooms where the shadows seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. But as they reached the front door, they found Marianne standing there, doll in hand. She didn't speak. She just smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that split her face like a tear. The villagers started avoiding the orphanage altogether, claiming they heard the cries of children echoing from within, even when no one was supposed to be awake. And when a brave few peered through the windows, they swore they saw the outline of Miss Winfield. Her skeletal face twisted into a cruel smile as she cradled Marianne's doll. The orphanage burned down in the winter of 1863. No one knew how the fire started, but when the flames finally died, the building's blackened remains stood like jagged teeth against the sky. No bodies were ever found, but to this day, travelers passing by the ruins sometimes report hearing faint footsteps in the grass and the distant sound of a child's voice singing a lullaby just before the wind carries it away. And some say if you look closely enough, you can still see the doll sitting among the ruins, watching. Victorian England, 1874. On a desolate stretch of moorland stood Briarwood Manor, a sprawling estate long abandoned by the living. The villagers of nearby Hollowbrook avoided it, claiming the manor was cursed. They spoke in hushed voices of the family that once lived there, the Blackthorns, and the unspeakable tragedy that befell them. But none could agree on what exactly had happened, only that something dark had taken root within the house, something that refused to die. The manor had been vacant for nearly 2 decades when a wealthy industrialist, Mr. Nathaniel Grayson, purchased the estate. He moved in with his wife, Eleanor, and their 2 children, Clara and Henry, determined to restore the manor to its former glory. But from the moment they crossed the threshold, the house seemed to breathe. It started with small things, doors that refused to stay shut, footsteps echoing through empty corridors, whispers slipping through the walls like smoke. The servants grew uneasy, and one by one they left, until only a single maid, Agnes, remained, too loyal to abandon the family. Clara, the eldest child, was the first to notice the figure in the garden. A woman in a tattered black gown, standing among the withered rose bushes. Her face was pale as bone, her eyes empty sockets. When Clara told her mother, Eleanor dismissed it as an overactive imagination. But that night, Clara woke to find muddy footprints trailing from the window to her bed. The disturbances escalated. Henry began waking in the middle of the night, screaming about a man standing in the corner of his room, his face twisted and burned. Eleanor found herself waking with bruises on her arms, shaped like fingers, and Nathaniel, ever the skeptic, began hearing his name called from the darkened hallways, though no one was there. Desperate for answers, Nathaniel sought out the village's oldest resident, a woman named Margaret Holloway. She told him the Blackthorn family had dabbled in occult practices, attempting to harness power from the spirit world. They had performed a ritual in the manor's cellar, a ritual that had gone horribly wrong. Something had answered their call, something hungry, and it had consumed the family one by one. Margaret warned Nathaniel to leave the manor, but he refused. He returned home, determined to confront whatever haunted his family. Armed with only a lantern, he descended into the cellar. The air grew colder with every step, the stone walls slick with moisture. At the far end of the room, he found a door that hadn't been there before. It opened on its own. Inside, he found a circle of ash and bone, symbols carved into the floor. The shadows seemed to writhe, twisting into contorted shapes. And in the center of the room stood Clara, her eyes black as pitch, a cruel smile on her lips. "We belong to the house now," she whispered, her voice layered with countless others. Nathaniel tried to grab her, but his hand passed through her like mist. The lantern flickered, its flame shrinking to a feeble glow. The shadows lengthened, and spectral figures emerged. The Blackthorns, their faces frozen in agony, their eyes hollow voids. They reached for Nathaniel, their fingers stretching like talons, dragging him to the floor. Upstairs, Eleanor sat in her parlor, staring at the fireplace. The flames cast grotesque shadows on the walls, shapes that twisted and danced. Henry sat by her side, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, a faint, vacant smile on his lips. He hadn't spoken since the night before, but when Agnes tried to leave the house, he turned to her and said, in a voice not his own, "You can't leave. The house doesn't like that." Agnes fled, her screams echoing through the manor. The front door, locked from the inside, refused to budge. She banged against it, splinters cutting her hands, but the wood seemed to pulse as if alive. She felt something cold touch her shoulder, and when she turned, Eleanor was standing there. Her eyes glazed, her skin gray, her mouth slowly stretching into an unnatural grin. By morning, Briarwood Manor was silent. The Graysons were never seen again, and the house fell into ruin. But travelers claim that on stormy nights, lights flicker in the manor's windows, and the faint echo of children's laughter drifts across the moor. Some say the Blackthorns still linger there. Others say the Graysons join them, and the house waits, patient, eternal, hungry. It is said that those who step too close to Briarwood hear faint whispers beneath the wind. Sometimes a child's giggle, other times a man's voice pleading for help. But the villagers know better than to investigate. They nail rosemary to their doors and scatter salt along their thresholds, praying that whatever festers inside Briarwood never finds its way out. Because when the fog grows thick and the nights stretch long, the house calls, and the lost always answer.